Greetings, I'm Ruben Martinez. I am here with my colleague Frank Fear at Future U. Future U is a forum where we discuss the influence and impact of neoliberalism on higher education. And we're very pleased today to have Kirsty Morrin, who is over at Liverpool, England. Kirsty is a sociologist. She earned her degree at the University of Manchester and has been writing considerably on issues of entrepreneurship and how it's related to inequalities. And we all know that entrepreneurship is one of the central ideas of neoliberalism, seeking to make entrepreneurs subjects of all of us. Also with us is Nathan Rousseau, who is also a sociologist. He's over at Indiana University, Purdue University, Columbus, and he will be making comments after Kirsty's presentation. So we are going to have a Q&A after that. Those of you who are on YouTube, welcome. We hope that you'll stay with us for the duration of the presentation. So with that, I am delighted to invite Dr. Kirsty Morrin to speak on Against Entrepreneurship, Educations, Nations, and Inequalities, which is the title of her presentation. So, Kirsty?
Hi, thank you, Ruben, and thank you for that kind introduction. So, yeah, I think I'm going to begin then by giving you a bit of an overview of the talk because it was introduced so nicely there. So today I'm going to be talking about my research a little bit more generally to show you how entrepreneurship has fitted into that over the last few years. And then I'm going to really sort of hone in on entrepreneurship as a concept in education and really think about it as a site of struggle over time. And one of the ways I'm going to do that is by introducing a framework that I've been working on to do struggle, as I've sort of coined it. And this is building on Raymond Williams' work on keywords to think about key sites of contradictions or key oxymorons, as I've coined them. So I'll talk you through some of that. And then I'll move on to give you a couple of examples of that in action, thinking about what I've called here aspirations and suffocation and sort of reproductive resistance. So these different kinds of logics that I think are contradictory in practice, and we can see them in forms of education, and in particular how entrepreneurship is within those educational sites. So to my research a little bit more generally then, to give you a sense of this, because of course people will have different kinds of experiences here. I'm from the English context, so I'm from England. I have done research in England, and that might look quite different to where you are, and I know it looks different to the context in the US, for example. So I've been doing research for quite a while now on the Academies program in England. And to give you a brief history context of what I mean by the Academies program, in the US context, it's probably most similar to the charter system, although it's very different in some ways as well. And we have these kind of what we might call public-private partnerships or interventions in education. We see them in places like Chile and also in Sweden, in the free schooler system, for example. So this isn't only in England, but I think there's a very particular kind of formation of this in England. And I'll, again, to give you a little bit of a brief history of that. So the Academies program in its very first formation was actually an entirely failed project in the 1980s under Thatcher's government. And they were called city academies, and there was about 15 of them opened, and these were in places that were in need, and I say in need in sort of inverted commas, because I think this idea of being in need, or a place or a school being in need of change, is a sort of part of a wider discourse that's quite problematic a lot of the time. We might call it as part of a deficit model of people and places that we see being put about, and I'll explain that in a second, what I mean by that fully. So the Academies program started there. They opened around 15 schools that were in need of some kind of intervention, monetary often, and they made these public-private schools partnerships. And then these didn't work. The policy was sort of forgotten about until Tony Blair came into power in 1997 and really picked this up and took it to the place we know today, where we now have in some parts of the system, 80% of schools are academized. So, it really has taken hold. It's been a systematic landscape change of how we know state education in England. So under Tony Blair, he said that if schools are failing by these auditory measures that we have called Ofsted, so that's the body that audits schools and says whether they're failing or not, might be something of interest for people to look up. There is a lot of resistance to some of the practices of Ofsted at the minute from people on the ground, teachers. Yeah, that's something that's really happening at the minute that hasn't happened so much before. So we have an auditory body that determines whether a school is seen as failing or not. And under the Tony Blair era, he said if a school is failing and it's in an area of statistical disadvantage, so if it has, low socioeconomic status groups, people who have low educational outcomes, health inequalities, that kind of thing, then these are the places we need to have public-private interventions. They're needed there. We need the investment up to £2 million at the time. But more importantly, and this is something that I think has really taken hold as part of a neoliberal project, but beyond that too, this idea that these will be cultural interventions on people and places. So that's what it looked like. And there was meant to be about 200 to 250 academy schools as part of that. And these were all in a secondary school capacity. So in the state system, you have from 4 years old to 11 years old, that's what we call primary school. From 11 years old to 16, we have secondary education. And then you do 16 to 18, that's your sort of pre-university years, and then 18 plus university. So I'm mainly focused in my research on the secondary provision of state education, but obviously this has expanded way beyond that now. So we move from the Tony Blair era where we have about 200 schools being opened. The school that I looked at, for example, a number of years ago, and have looked at since in different kinds of discursive ways, was one of the original academy schools. And as part of those interventions, sponsors came in and took over the school. They determined curriculum, they determined sort of how staff worked, they govern the school. It's kind of taken out of the hands of local authority. And if we think about some of the arguments around neoliberalism, of course, this is part of that project too. But that in some ways we think about neoliberalism as that rolling back of the state. This looks like that, but in practice, in some ways, the state is also, while centralising schools, also sort of reaching out to local communities with these sponsorships that they're putting in and deciding who should run the schools. So the school that I looked at, for example, the sponsor that came in was somebody who brought with them a cultural initiative around entrepreneurship. So the entire school, it has what it calls an entrepreneurship specialism. And this it has various different practices and mechanisms. One of them was compulsory entrepreneurship lessons for the first 2 years of school life. They had actual business pods, so startup pods for students and local business people to run their businesses from within the school, and students could interact with that. They also had, I think, the heart of the cultural scheme of the school, I think, and the cultural entrepreneurial scheme of the school. It had what I've called a badges of entrepreneurship scheme. So behaviours identified as creative, determined, passionate, risk-taking, team-working, problem-solving. If you display these behaviours, they're seen as entrepreneurial, and you win badges to add to your entrepreneurial currency or your bank account, and you win prizes for these things. So we can see the language of entrepreneurship sort of taking up the language that we might associate with different kinds of practices and behaviours. And this has been rolled out. This isn't the only school that does this. There's about, I think, 13 schools now under this sponsorship and leadership. And of course, since 2010, we now see, since the first Conservative coalition government in 2010, they completely opened up the doors to academization and what some people have called a sort of privatization of state education. And we don't mean that in terms of profit making, but in terms of decision making, governance, accountability, democracy, local democracies, for example, where we now have 80% of secondary provision academized. So schools can opt in. There's incentives to opt in, and some schools are still being forced by these what some people might say non-objective, quite problematic measures. And primary provision, so the age 4 to 11 provision, is now 40% academized. So we see a huge shift in the last 25 years from the early 2000s when this was first came about to an almost entirely academised system in the secondary provision, and a really increased provision of academy schools in the primary school sector too. So that's just to give you a bit of an overview of kind of what it looks like and where I started thinking about these things. And as part of the research, I suppose entrepreneurship, I could see it in terms of the sponsorship of the school. I could also see it in terms of the kinds of curricula that the school put in. But I also, and I think this was one of the most important things that I could see, and it's been talked about in different kinds of literature. Darren Wallace has just written an amazing book called The Culture Trap, and that's about the UK system or the English system, I should say. Just again, England has a different education system to Scotland, Wales, and the north of Ireland. So we have UK policy that informs everything, all four of those places, but we have devolved systems. So it's free to go to university in Scotland, it's not in England. The academies are only happening in England at the minute. So yeah, I think that's, if that's of interest again, or important information that people might not know. So one of the things that I noticed was the kinds of places that were being picked up in the initial stages of academization to put academies in, this idea of a failing school, this idea of an area with particular kinds of statistical disadvantage, and how they were being narrated as in deficit. It wasn't, you know, materially in deficit, it was talked about as in cultural deficit. So people and places and parents and students, teachers even, were being talked about as being the failures of those schools, and historically having those kinds of failures. It was really, I think, a very individualized, pathological, and even moralizing initiative. And this really allowed for academies to take hold in the first place. I always think if you want to know what's coming next, look at the places where people are most marginalized, because that's usually where it's happening first. So I really think academies started in those places, and this is why we see, and people weren't necessarily resistant to the idea that these people were in need in a particular way, which I obviously completely disagree with. But yeah, that's where we are, and that's what I've been looking at in some ways. And I've been trying to think about entrepreneurship beyond this context, and also in a more connected way, I suppose, historically and spatially. So one of the questions I keep thinking is, well, you know, I'm talking about academies as privatising the system, but has it kind of always been privatised? If we think about who makes decisions, it's always been sort of business people or local politicians, and who really has ever had a say in that kind of a forum. But that's a slightly different point, and is probably going to be in a book that I'm trying to write that should be out at some point, called Academies, Entrepreneurship, Inequality, The Politics of Successful Failure. So today then, beyond this bit of research, I'm going to explore a little bit more in depth what I've been thinking about in terms of entrepreneurship as a concept, as an in-place practice, as I think a discursive tool, and you know, think about that a little bit more in depth. So to begin with then, I looking at entrepreneurship, even as a sort of word, where does it come from? How did it come about? So in English, the word entrepreneur comes from the French word which means to undertake. And I think this idea of entrepreneurship as a vocation is something that has maybe shifted in more recent years, but I think is an important place to start. So entrepreneurship is something that you do. And we see entrepreneurship emerging in European literatures, at least, way back in the 1700s. We have the sort of Irish economist who has French roots, as well as many of these people do in this list, thinking about entrepreneurship as something that exists. We then have the sort of pejorative term of, you know, the economic man emerging in Mills and then Keynes and Ingram, and these people thinking about a homo economicus, that's a purely rational subject who can be the ideal entrepreneur, as we might put it. In Victorian England, we actually see people taking hold of some of these ideas, and people like Samuel Smiles thinking about his books like Self-Help or Thrift, and thinking about how individuals should be creative as part of a wider nation call. But again, we still see this vocation, I think, being put about in terms of how we can do this stuff, or how we should do entrepreneurship, rather than, I think, at the later instantations, being an entrepreneur as a set of kinds of subjectivities and behaviours. Schumpeter's creative destruction, something that's obviously quite well known, thinking about that being something that is important to keep, to destroy in some ways economic systems in order to innovate them and keep them going. And I think one of the ways that entrepreneurship is often talked about, especially in education literature, is through Foucault's notion of being an entrepreneur or entrepreneurs of self as an idealized form of neoliberal subjectivity. And it's this shift of like the meaning of entrepreneurship that I think I found quite important in thinking about entrepreneurship as a concept. And I even typed in entrepreneurship to a Word document where it gives you some suggestions of different kinds of synonyms. And the new form of synonym that comes up on Microsoft Word is tycoon, magnate, impresario. My reading's not very good, sorry. But yeah, you can see how that shift is slightly different. These words are, we might call them neoliberal, but they feel very contemporary in a quite particular way. And I think that the shift to certain kinds of business, managerial, capitalists, in a really obvious and also powerful way, rather than being somebody who's working from the bottom up. These are the people now running and creating the sort of discursive material spaces that we live in and operate in. So that was my first sort of place to begin. What does this mean? And then thinking about how that actually looks. So one of the things that I was thinking beyond entrepreneurship as a concept was actually how entrepreneurship then becomes somewhat an ideal every narrative in terms of different kinds of places or nations. And this goes a little bit beyond the English context and a bit beyond that European context too. Now, I want to say I sort of know Gurminder Bhambra's critique of the idea of an ideal type being embedded in a certain kind of European modern or European notions of like modernity, and actually understanding that historically there's been multiple modernities and often those are not understood throughout history or recognized or written down. But I think there's something that is not saying that this is universal, but that it is ever expanding. And actually, maybe we might think about this as a sort of new neo-colonial form of neoliberal entrepreneurial struggle. So, for example, in the English context, it's not just about schools. Entrepreneurship is not just something that's in different kinds of policy or economic forms, as we might think about it when I was thinking about it as a concept just then. But David Cameron here in 2010, as he expands the Academies programme and embeds some of these things much more widely, he says that we need to light the fires of entrepreneurialism in every corner of our country, and this must begin in schools. But we also have people like Sari Alfi-Nissan, who is talking about the Israeli context, talking about entrepreneurship as an ethno-national character. And we have Nugyara talking about edupreneurship, so education and entrepreneurship as a joint venture, as a nation character, and this is in Indonesia. So we can see in some ways that I think, as I say, an ever-expanding neo-colonial project, I would argue, and something that isn't just in English schools, although, as part of a colonial project, England is often a useful place to start, as we know historically and in contemporary forms too. So if one of the arguments is about entrepreneurship being having different kinds of meanings, but also having quite a significantly similar meaning in different places currently, I think then it's also important to start introducing some of the contradictions of this, because I think entrepreneurship is so wielding as a word, as a practice, in its meaning. In some ways, it can kind of subsume lots of different kinds of practices. And what I want to do here is to start unpicking different kinds of contradictions, as is my framework that I'm going to outline a little bit later, to just stay and understand that even if we're using the word entrepreneur sometimes, it doesn't take away that there are different kinds of practices of resistance, and acknowledge and recognize those at the same time. So just two examples of that here to think about, even though we might identify positively with some of those practices, the word is still being used in a way that it's kind of subsumed within a wider discourse. So Refayan McElwey's work on refugee sub-entrepreneurship talks about the ways in which refugees have often had to operate outside of governing authorities to survive and create their own kinds of businesses and own kinds of, self-employment. So just recognizing that even if we recognize that practice as entrepreneurial or not, or if the government or the authority or the nation coins it like that or not, these things exist, these people live their lives, they are also having practices that need to be recognized. And also, thinking about their narratives and stories and their forms of social mobility as legitimate and there as well. And Hannah Jones, who is an academic at Warwick in England, talked about, it's not an article, but she wrote a blog piece where she talked about the idea of entrepreneurial sociology. And she said she recognises that this language often can be used in lots of different ways, and we might critique that language a lot of the time. But it doesn't mean that some of the practices of entrepreneurship, so being disruptive, being creative, are positive practices and ones that might actually start to undo some of the stuff that we might critique. So again, we can see this, I like to call it contradictions, to try to hold both things at the same time, because I think they're both important. We can say this is a ideal every narrative. We can critique the ideal in and of itself as a concept, but we can also see these different kinds of practices within that. So trying to hold those things in tension, but both as true at the same time, I think starts to unpack a little bit where my framework is going to come from when I get to it in a couple of slides. So as well as a concept and a discourse, I'm going to now think about entrepreneurship as in two different ways in education specifically. So I've talked about it more generally, but here for the next two slides, I'm going to talk about how I think it looks. So here we have a quote from Dan Cohen, who talks about the US context. And he talks about the way in which venture philanthropists or venture entrepreneurs have become part of different kinds of municipal governments. And this is very much the same in terms of the English Academies system, where sponsors come in and take the role of what would have been local governments. So he says, as municipal governments in the US struggle under austerity, philanthropic elites have seemingly come to the rescue. Their money has not come without strings attached, however, and I think it's a really important point. We might, quote unquote, need some intervention, some might disagree with that need, but how that happens, who gets to say, and who wields more power and profit a lot of the time is often something that goes largely unquestioned. And just a few other people who've talked about these kinds of ventures into education. Saltman talked about the charter system back in 2010, and the idea that people were sort of making venture investments now in the education system. Lindsay McGui's talked about philanthrocapitalism as a new or an emerging concept. I think she has a new book on agnotology, so the study of ignorance, which I think is quite an interesting addition to this part of her work. Warwick Mansley was actually a really great journalist in England, has talked about the privatisation of the academy system. So, for example, he did a bit of research on one of the biggest academy chains, because we now have chains, which is something that I didn't go into detail on later, but academies who operate multiple schools now open what they call multi-academy trusts, and they can be the sort of overarching umbrella and take in other failing schools, and they become what the local authority used to do. And he was saying some of the big chains, if you go right down to the heart of the decision-making body, it's usually just two people. One he looked at was like two people in a room. So, democracy isn't really there in the way that it even used to be. Whether we could say it was perfect then, I don't think we could, but I think it's not as good as it was even then. And Pat Thompson, actually, again, from the English system, she's at Nottingham, I think. She talks about a few different cases of corruption that we've seen recently in these newly privatised contexts of state education. So just some text, but also some people I think that are talking really well about how entrepreneurship looks in through these different kinds of entrepreneurial ventures in schools. And then honing in down to think about the curricula and how this looks in practice, maybe within different kinds of initiatives. I've already mentioned one in some ways from my own research, but just to historicise that slightly and to talk about some newer instantations of it too. So entrepreneurship education has been about longer than how it looks now, and it's been about longer than the Academies programme. Actually, a guy called Lord Young, who wrote a policy in 2014, has been writing policies and making interventions on the enterprise education, entrepreneurship education in the English context since way before that. He was integral in the 1980s to something that was called the Youth Training Scheme. And this was, again, seen as quite widely as not really working. This got young people into starting up their own businesses. And as a vocation, again, you see that vocation through to some of the new spirits of entrepreneurship, I'll argue, that are more behaviour, mindset-based, culture-based. But he is still writing the policies, and in 2014 he wrote a policy that said in every level of education, through from primary right through to university, we need to have entrepreneurship, enterprise for all, as he said. And we see that. So to tell you about the school that I looked at again, although this was an intervention that was praised nationally as a great scheme, something that was prize-winning, something that really worked, the school that I looked at, because it was a failing school, so a lot of students weren't getting the outcomes that they needed. And we do that. One of the outcomes is what we call 5A star to C, sort of 5 grades that are in the system, sort of mid-ranging grades. And if your students get below that, then they're seen as failing in some ways. So grade C, and that's changed to numbers now to make it even more complicated. So you have to get a grade 4 or 5. But one of the measures of failure is around those grades. So at one point, the school, when it was academized, it was about, I think, around 27% of students were getting those 5 grades that they needed, which obviously is not good enough. And not to blame the people, of course, but there's something about the system that's not working, people's material conditions, all these things. We come in, we have an entrepreneurial intervention, and that average goes right up to about 64% in 2013 or 2012 actually, and which was above the national average. This looks like a real, thing. And then Michael Gove, who was a politician, who was the education minister at the time, came in and changed how we did examinations. So instead of sitting modular exams where you could repeat things and sit them in different year groups, it was a one-time only exam, and the grades dropped right back down to 33% of students again, even all those years later. So in 2013-14, only 33% were getting those 5 or more grades. And now the school, as of this year, January this year, I think it was, it's now failing again. So we see the cycle of failure of this initiative, and yet this is being pumped around the country. There is, without any evidence, frankly, that it works, apart from maybe these short-term fluctuations, there are many other schools being opened under this kind of stuff. And finally, to sort of bring it back round, I think in university terms, there was, I won't say the university, but there's a university that opened a research centre to try to see how to best do entrepreneurship education. So again, without much research or evidence that it works, we now have universities putting money into centres where people are researching this to try to make it better. And this isn't just happening here. I know it's happening across the world in some ways. I have a lot of students from China, for example, who work within an entrepreneurship education centre, and we have a partnership with them, and I have some students who research this too. So it's a complicated picture, but I think you can see how this is being embedded largely across different systems. Hopefully, I've been talking for quite a while, so sorry if that's a bit too long. But so I'm going to move on to my framework then. So how have I tried to understand this? Where is the idea of being against entrepreneurship come from, and what do I mean by that? So of course, I've got a bit of a list here of people who have, we might say, been in the tradition of being against, very overtly in the language that I use. They talk about being against. And obviously this is not exhaustive, But I think the idea of being against is to try to put a bit of a stop into just analysing what's happening or trying to critique it, because if we keep having this as a foundation, as a taken for granted foundation in education and beyond, then I think we're going to have these continuations of different kinds of inequalities and problems. So to be against, I'm taking sort of guidance or building on a foundation of other thinkers like Joe Littler, who talked about, did a book called Against Meritocracy, where she sort of did a genealogy of the different discourses and practices associated with meritocracy. And that's something that I've done, tried to go back and dig and think about that genealogical framework and how it plays out in different discursive practices. Thinking about Ollie Mould's work Against Creativity, where he really thinks about not only how creativity can be something that is subsumed into corporate speak, to think about how businesses use the idea of creativity to make more money and to have quite bad practices for people and workplaces, but also how people operate within that in really creative ways. So how people are resistant and overtly resisting some of those things, and holding those two things in tension, I think, again, is something I've taken spirit from. Of course, there's an edited collection here by the very same name, Against Entrepreneurship, where different business scholars take different kinds of theoretical approaches, including Marxist, different kinds of feminist approaches, to think about entrepreneurship, some really useful texts in there to draw on. And then also Stephen Ball and Geordie Collett-Saab's work Against Schools, to think about that epistemological critique that underlies all of this. We have discourses, we have practices, we have sort of reproduction and resistance, but we also have this broader epistemological critique of entrepreneurship. What does it mean? Where does it come from? How is it a certain kind of knowledge formation? And how might we resist some of that in some ways? So this builds on in my own sort of frameworks over the last few years. And I just thought it'd be easy to lay out a few different ways in which that has changed and developed. So I think largely I was brought up in a generation of Bourdieusian scholars in sociology, where I was very interested in education research, but also my own sort of trajectory from, first generation university goer into a university, setting into a, quite an elite context that I had no cultural knowledge of or sense of, and the unsettledness in that sort of biographical thing, but also in the literature that I was reading. So Omar Lizardo's work on unsettledness in Bourdieusian concepts, or Jin's work on this sort of ontological ambivalence that is at the heart of a lot of the concepts that sometimes are applied a little bit more flatly. So things like habitus, for example, I think what I drew on that, as well as, personally, but what I found most useful about it was that tension, was that step back from where he talks about like the internal, external, and the movement in that. It's not just saying, oh, this is habitus. It's like, well, how do those things move and how are they unsettled in some ways? And that was something that I took forward in a couple of different pieces here. I've put some of the publications on the left there. And then I move forward to thinking about how do we think about things that seem ontologically irreconcilable. So again, we're moving through to quite contradictory things here. And I talked about the entrepreneurial badges scheme in the school, and thinking about what does it mean to have different theories of power that inform different theories of practices. So I looked at Bourdieu and Foucault and de Certeau and thought about how do their different theories speak to each other or not, and how do we reconcile some of this seemingly eclectic group of people, but actually if we see some of the ways in which they are unsettled, or where they land power or where they don't, I think there's something quite useful there. But then I thought there's something about not reconciling the thing or the theories that's really important. So I moved through to thinking about contradictory frameworks, and this is where I've sort of ended up and will end up in the book, but also in my framework of what I've called key oxymorons. So key oxymorons, I've said here, are another vocabulary of society and culture. And again, that's playing on Raymond Williams' work, Keywords, a Vocabulary of Society and Culture, where he sort of looks back at different key terms that become important at different times in society. And thinking about entrepreneurship as an expression of something that is contradictory in society, and as my book's going to be called, as a real site of successful failure. So something that is in constant failure, but is such a successful, logic, discourse, practice, material reality for a lot of people. And within that as well, I was thinking about the ways in which things are unsettled and contradictory, and how the contradiction itself is what I want to invite people to think about. I don't want to just think about movement or resistance, for example, in moments of crisis. I want it to be an everyday thing. We don't just have success or failure at different times. We have both of them in constant conflict all the time in people's lives. And I quite like Valverde's work on the idea of nuisance logics, because I think sometimes, especially if more marginalized communities, sometimes resistance is also only seen in moments of crises. But I think there's a way that, whether we write about it or not as academics, that people live and negotiate and resist every single day. And I think acknowledging that tension all the time, that struggle, is part of why I wanted this conceptual framework to be in tension itself. And of course, there's a multiplicity and a simultaneousness that I think is really important. As Valorvan talks about in Paul Gilroy's work, he says, after Empire, the book was not about convivial multicultural on one hand and melancholic nationalism on the other. It's very much instead about how both projects are simultaneously competing for validity in the lives of modern Britons. And I think that really captures how both things can be true at the same time. So here, just to finally reiterate what I actually mean, this is from a piece of writing I did as part of a book, an edited collection that I edited with some colleagues, Christy, Kulz and Ruth McGinity. For me, key oxymorons are stepping back into contradiction. It's not an undoing of the existing concept, but rather a re-emphasis of that processual or oscillatory qualities of power, practice, thinking and action. Taking habitus as an example, I acknowledge it's a generative thinking tool in its inception and connection to other concepts. You can see other concepts and problems with that from people like Diane Ray. The key oxymoron invites us to step back into the process of the subjective objective, the external internal, thinking about those oscillatory qualities of each as we move through analysis and writing. In this way, oxymorons are the heuristic thinking tools, not applicatory concepts. In writing, the key oxymorons bring to the surface the gap between the heterogeneity of the world and its closure in written text. So for the last couple of slides then, because I have been talking for quite a while now, so apologies. I'm just going to give you a couple of those oxymorons that I think explain some of the context that I've looked at, and then I'll close. So material immaterialities. I think this is something that can explain a lot of different kinds of contexts. But in the context of the research that I've done on the Entrepreneurial Academy, for example, I think the word entrepreneurship, the practice of entrepreneurship, is something that Wright has called the thin air thesis. And she drew on Leadbitter's 1999 speech. He was an advisor to Tony Blair. And he said, I'll read the quote from him. He said, "The generation, application, exploitation of knowledge is what drives modern economic growth. Most of us make our money from thin air. We produce nothing that can be weighed, touched, or easily measured. Our output is not stockpiled in harbours, stored in warehouses, or shipped in railway cars. Our children will not have to toil in dark factories, descend into pits, or suffocate in mills. They will not hew raw materials or turn them into manufactured products. They will make their living through creativity, ingenuity, and imagination." And I think this idea that it's all sort of built on thin air and something was quite useful for thinking about the way in which entrepreneurship was being sold as a sort of aspirational thing, as something to be, as something that you must be in order to survive and thrive in the modern society. And we match this with that sort of contradictory idea that actually those people that they're trying to give these aspirations to largely had aspirations in the first place. They just weren't recognized as aspirational. And therefore we see this deficit imaginary of places in need in a very particular cultural way. And I've written about that. My colleagues, Kirsty, Kulz and Sarah Leaney have too. So I've thought about the idea in which entrepreneurial aspirations become in some ways this symbolic suffocation of particular groups in society. And my sort of final empirical slide was something that I did a little bit more recently in England. there's been a bit of a rise of school protests, and TikTok is a hub for, I actually think it's quite an incredible site for lots of different reasons, but lots of young people in the UK were uploading their school protests to TikTok, and the comments section was such a rich site of thinking about how people were, or young people were thinking about what protests meant in their context. So I was thinking about the idea of a reproductive resistance within this new context of academization, of entrepreneurship. What kinds of entrepreneurship are recognized as legitimate or not? You know, is actually being aware of your surroundings and fighting back, and is that not an entrepreneurial trait in itself? There was a really big case of school pupil resistance in London at a school called Pimlico Academy, and this was against the racism that they saw within their school context. It ended in them burning the Union Jack. Actually, this is a school that's largely made up of students of colour, Black students, in a really diverse context in London, inner city London. And of course, this garnered lots of backlash from the media. But the students were making really valid points about different kinds of historical forms of racism within the school and the context that they were in. And when I was looking at the TikTok videos, this here is just one on the screen, but here were some of the conversations or the comments that were underneath it. Year sevens be like, so this is year seven is the first year of secondary school. And people are saying, well, everybody's kind of doing it now. So if you're in year seven, this is just kind of how it is. What in the UK, because it's something that's happening everywhere. People discussing when they were having protests, some protests on Monday for us, our friends doing it on Friday, our school's doing it now. Everybody, I'm just waiting my turn. And then people discussing how they organise them. So how do you even organise these? How do you manage to get everyone onto it? I want to go private, I really want to protest. So even within this context, I think one of the things that I was trying to illuminate here was the idea that even within a context of quite difficult, heavy discourses and authorities, actually, you know, I think we're living quite an authoritarian time at the minute. There are still people trying to push back, and young people, and just sort of recognizing that we have resistance, even though it might not change everything overall. It might reproduce some of those logics at the same time, those entrepreneurial logics. You know, it's still important to recognize that and see how maybe the cumulative effect of that would be important, or, you know, these things might change something down the line. And that's where I want to end, really, just by saying that I think I see the idea of being against entrepreneurship as something that I see we should recognise that the structural risk, the idea that it's about real concerted forms of precarity, and we might even argue near-colonial intervention, but also as a recognition that of those who are against in sort of solidarity, care, resistance, and importantly, hope. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirsty. What an excellent presentation. Very insightful. Reminds me of a lot of stuff that's going on here in the United States, but in a different way. But let's go ahead and turn to our discussant, Nathan Rousseau. Nathan, you're on.
Well, I have to say that I was lucky enough to hear Kirsty discuss some of these issues before. So this is my second take on this, and man, there's so much here, and I love it when there's so much here to talk about. So I wrote down a few things, and I'd like to just bring them up. We can talk about any of these. Some of them are framed in the form of questions, some of them in the form of statements. The first one is, so is entrepreneurship a last gasp of colonization? So we can talk about that, or I can just keep rolling on. I'll keep rolling on. So, okay. Is the appropriate response to essentially neoliberalism, entrepreneurship, a return to subsistence living, and a return to superstitious beliefs. A reaction to neoliberalism through fiction, novels, popular film. In other words, people will talk about fictional accounts of exploitation through neoliberalism rather than taking it on in real life. And somehow that eases the frustration and anger. In the process, commodifying dissent. Third is the movement against education and school, which you certainly are seeing in the US. And I'm reminded of Pink Floyd and The Wall, where one of the songs goes, "We don't need no education," which of course is grammatically incorrect. I don't know if that was on purpose. But did the members of Pink Floyd realize when they were writing that song that that would lead to a movement against people becoming educated, rather than a comment that wake up people? And is we don't need no education a part of colonization? The fourth thing, and then I have three more things in their statements. Intellectuals tend to get bogged down by complexity, so everything becomes individualized. Intellectuals tend to get bogged down by complexity, so everything becomes individualized, and a competition over visions which lose sight of the underlying issues. I've gone to so many meetings where the intentions are very good, but the whole thing becomes a discussion over visions, the meaning of words, and ultimately about very little that is affecting them in real life. Education through entrepreneurship has become reduced to keywords like excellence, quality. And one of the things that you said, Kirsty, that I've been actually talking about for quite a while, which is aspiration. These are keywords that actually have been emptied of meaning. So they form an excellent distraction. And in the process, what happens is that there's no content in the classroom, so that people actually don't acquire the skills they need to achieve excellence and quality. They're not taught the things that it is assumed that they will be taught. And finally, I would say that the number one issue that prevents resistance is fear. And this is one of the most powerful aspects of today's colonization. So your presentation got me thinking about all of those things and more, but that's all I could write down.
Kirsty, we'll turn it to you.
Thank you. Thank you for all those things. Again, made me think a lot about how to frame some of the stuff and maybe some of the things to really drive a little bit more as well, if I write this up. So I might not have got all the questions down, but the ones I did get down in time. So you said, is it a last gasp of colonization? And I wonder whether it's just colonization coming home a little bit. So, you know, England's put it around the world for a very long time, and whether that's kind of finally coming home a little bit. So in some ways, yeah, a last gasp, but a very different iteration of it, and it just coming back to bite us in a way that, you know, I won't say any more on that. But so, and then you said about a return to subsistence living and beliefs. And so there's two things I was thinking of here. The first one was just a really powerful narrative that was as part of this like completing discourse. I think, as I say, whether it's competing or completing, was the discourse around austerity. And this discourse was used to actually promote the idea that these academies were needed in different kinds of places. So the idea that for generations, people have been on benefits and didn't want to work and had no aspirations. I don't think I said that so strongly, but this, for example, the place that I looked at, you know, in the local newspaper, the sponsor wrote that the status quo here is that people have had generations on benefits and they don't want to work. And that's just it's not statistically true. It's not true in terms of research that I'd done before that around people's aspirations. I'm from there, you know. I also know it like personally through those kinds of connections too. But this was so powerful that I think people distance themselves or want to distance themselves from that kind of narrative. So this idea of doing it for yourself and that more individualized form of thinking about, well, I work hard and I do make my own for my family. I think that's so ingrained and so embedded that I think that's part of it. And then also going right back historically, really weirdly, I was thinking about like religious beliefs. And I think if you go far enough back, not to be too Weberian, this kind of religion is there. And when the school was being built, there was also, for new academies at the time, they scrapped a building schools for the future project, which was about school buildings that needed to be replaced. And they replaced it with the Academies building programme, which had like £10 million for each building. And the school that I looked at had a new building built. And to do that, they had a site where the school already was, but the sponsor didn't want it there. And there was something called a Pathfinder scheme. And this was a big project across the UK where the government put out pathways for places that they thought they could make more desirable culturally, and they knocked down people's houses. They compulsorily purchased people's houses and businesses, and then knocked them down to build what they wanted. And this happens all over the country. So you have no choice really, where you're a homeowner or not. So there was a 2-year legal battle in the town over the space in the centre of town for businesses, doctor surgeries, people's houses. And eventually everybody was moved out and the school, the houses were flattened. And it's cited as like really bad practice in policy now because it ended up meaning that the building cost £49 million instead of 10 million because of legal fees and delays. But it was still, the project must go ahead. But when they knocked all the buildings down, they disturbed loads of mass graves from a Methodist church across the road. It was a lot of family graves because of, the plague at the time. And I was thinking about, so as part of the book, I have all these little bits of narratives, but that might lead into some interesting things. One of them was thinking about Methodism as a breakaway from the Church of England for working class people, and the idea that you can be your own mediator between yourself and God, rather than having these high priests, and how entrepreneurship is another form of that, So in some ways, yes and no, but that's just what I thought of when you asked that question. So I don't know if it actually answers it, but it's a roundabout way. What else? We talked about maybe commodifying dissent and Pink Floyd. And I wonder whether there's a couple of things or multiple things, whether there's a recognition that education has always failed some people and that what education is for has never really been good enough for certain kinds of communities. So those communities have often educated themselves. I'm thinking about like supplementary schools for Black communities in the UK, for example. So I think maybe there's a recognition that it's not going to work for some communities, no matter how many times we tinker with or reform it. But I do also accept that I think individualism is so steeped within some of the ways that we do things that it's really difficult to break out of of that too. You know, we think about Gen Z young people being really active and stuff, but then I read some comments as well, and I think that the way that they seem to do this, there's some collectivity, but there's also a real steeped individualism, because, you know, the governments are not selling aspirations anymore. And I think that's a real issue. You know, in part of my PhD research, actually, aspirations was a key thing that I talked about. I sort of brought aspiration and entrepreneurship together as two concepts that I think really speak to each other. But yeah, I agree on the individualism side of things, but I do think maybe there is a more nuanced questioning of what the system is and what education is for people. I don't know if that's everything, but that's all I've written down, so I'm going to stop there.
One of the things can I?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Okay. One of the things that I've been on the question of religion. Okay, this is kind of a side note. There is so much money being invested today in entertainment, and even information is entertainment, you know, infotainment or something. It's called something like that. And if you think about it, it's as if one of the most profitable industries today is selling fantasy. And I think there's a few reasons for this. One is, obviously, it's profitable. Number two, it's a means of distracting people from their own precarity. It's a safe way to talk about a precarious situation that one is living in, so that one talks about a character. They may be able to relate to that character, but that character has nothing to do with real life. And so it becomes easier to talk about fictional accounts. In fact, people begin to believe more in the fictional accounts of real life because they really can't trust the news media. So fictional accounts become more reliable than news media. This is a great way to add to the confusion. But the other thing I want to say, and this is really in regards to religion, one of the things that I've really has shocked, and literally has shocked me, is the degree to which superstition has made a comeback. And what I mean by that is that people are more likely to depend upon superstitious beliefs today than they were 40, 50 years ago. And this is going to lead to a couple of things. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is, if you think about religion in a literal sense, that you think about stories, say in the Bible, as literal events, what you're going to wind up with is a religion of death. The whole story of Christ, taken in a literal sense, is actually a real downer. But if you take religious stories metaphorically, whereby there's less superstition involved in them, religion becomes essentially a religion of life. So biblical stories become actually about empowerment. And so what you see then is a split in terms of how people are able to talk about religion and today's neoliberal society. They can either talk about it metaphorically and, boy, this is bad stuff, or they can talk about it literally and basically depend upon fantasy. What I'm saying is that today's precarity has increased superstitious beliefs and ironically led to a certain kind of literalism in order to believe in something rather than precarity. And I prefaced all this by saying this is kind of a side note. So I realize that I'm on a little bit of a side, a tangent here, but I just wanted to put that out there, because if you think about it, one, selling fantasy has become so profitable, and religion has become such a part of entrepreneurship. So that essentially, not only has education become usurped, but another institution, religion, has also become usurped. Hope itself has become a business practice.
Christy, you want to speak to some of that?
I don't really know. I think it probably depends on which kinds of groups and how those things have also grown in particular groups. I'm just thinking slightly anecdotally, but also thinking about some stuff on conspiracy theories and how people have engaged with political forums or not over time. Like which communities, leaving religion aside for a second, but which communities have ever believed in that system or have always had to find their own way or have always had to be questioning. And, this, again, to try and hold the tension of the two things, being questioning is a positive thing, being critical is a positive thing. But again, that's being weaponized, I think, quite a lot in particular kinds of forums, and expertise as we know it is also questioned. Medical stuff is questioned in a particular way. Again, good things to do, but at the point at which it's deteriorating some of the stuff that is important for a functioning society, I think. But yeah, I'm not so versed on religion, and I also think there's so many different kinds of ways people engage with it, and yeah, it's an interesting question, but it is something that I have been thinking about a lot in terms of like those longer histories of where this comes from and what it is, and how that impacts on what we can say about today. And I always people go back to the 1980s for obvious reasons in the UK, but what happens if we go back even further than even Victorian England and mass public education? And I've been thinking about that quite a bit, but I know that doesn't answer anything that you just said, but just some more thoughts.
If I can jump in
Yeah,
here.
of course.
Ideologies of domination have always been presented as things that you can't change. So the Lord's told us that they were heaven sent, and if they're heaven sent, nothing you can do about it. Then they switched over to nature and said, women are inferior by nature, minorities are inferior by nature. If that's the case, nothing can be done about it. And then Margaret Thatcher comes along and says, there is no alternative. I mean, this is it, right? And I think President Clinton had a similar line as well. So basically, these are just ideologies that tell us that we have to accept our lot in life because that's the way things are. And that's part of the neoliberal ideology, right? That there is no alternative to this. But of course, we know that there are alternatives, and people soothe themselves with knowing that there is no alternative by shifting over to things that make them feel good. And I think that's part of what Nathan is talking about. But I'm very interested in knowing, the political economy of education, I think, is a wonderful concept. And I'd be very interested in knowing, one, here the charter schools and all of that stuff came into being through political interventions. And I assume that's the same case over in England. And as such, then how did this happen? Was it Tony Blair that set all these policies in motion? Who was doing this? And what did they anticipate was going to happen, that they really would create entrepreneurial subjects in these statistically disadvantaged academies? And what did they displace in the academy in order to insert this kind of curriculum?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of like policy intervention, I think it happened in very different ways in different places. So there was the initial policy idea of bringing some kind of private into the public state system, and that was in the 1980s. And like I say, that was an entirely failed policy. 15 schools opened, and then, you know, that didn't go any further. But the policy itself was still there in some ways, I think, for Tony Blair to pick up and say, oh, we'll take these little bits of it and we'll repackage it. And I think the way that he packaged it was very New Labour and very powerful, because it was also mapped onto, again, this idea of some places just being in deficit, people not having aspirations, people not caring about their own lives, not wanting things, particular kinds of communities failing themselves over generations rather than the system itself failing those people. And it was connected to the students and the parents as well. The parents were really integral, I think, to the way that that was talked about. So I think, is that the kind of thing that you're talking about in terms of like how it actually came about? And then, you know, for example, the people who were put forward as people who could sponsor schools. So this was religious groups or business people or people who claimed to have some kind of useful intervention in changing educational outcomes. I think that's what they wanted. They wanted this to make educational grades and outcomes better. But of course, how they did that was left open to interpretation in many different ways in each individual academy in some ways. Weirdly, so they're a state school, and in the English system, we have private schools, which are independent schools. But the Academies programme, it's a state school, but that calls itself independent because it's not part of the governance body that maintain schools are. So it's all this, like, again, language and symbolism of what the school system actually is. But some of the people that were first put forward, so the guy who sponsored the academy that I looked at was actually a top 10 donor to New Labour at the time, and then opened up one of the first academies and then subsequently other academies. And he modelled the academy on himself. He was the ideal entrepreneur. He made his money, he made his billions through middle contracts in government policies. So again, we see that thing sort of rolling on. And then at that time, they had to provide up to £2 million investment. So it was about money as well. It wasn't just about this cultural initiative. And this is something I missed off of the presentation, actually. When the Conservative coalition government came in 2010, nobody had to give money anymore. It was just about the cultural intervention. So there is no public-private partnership beyond an ideological one in multiple ways. So, yeah.
Thank you. Nathan, did you have a comment as well?
No, not on this.
I want to get back to the idea of leadership, and I appreciate the slide that you presented. You know, it's always bothered me here that in the States, business leadership is greatly associated with business. Mm-hmm. And we know that leadership is both very multidimensional, multifaceted, and contextual, right? Mm-hmm. But to reduce leadership to business and business success, I think to some extent helps people blame themselves for lack of their success, right? And knowing that, hey, yeah, it's good to be trained as an entrepreneur, but if I don't have the capital to you know, make material my ideas, nothing's going to happen, and then it must be my fault that I have failed at becoming a good entrepreneur. Can you speak to some of that and how it's playing out in your setting?
Absolutely. I think that's the key point about the entrepreneurial initiative, because it can take on all successes and deflect all failures, because there's nothing really there. Then it becomes the problem of the individual and their parents, you know, the students and the parents and even the teachers. And I was just thinking about this in the context of accountability and democracy. So Andrew Wilkins, who's at Goldsmiths in London, he did a project about 2017, I think, where he looked at governors in schools. And so governors have historically been made up of local persons, interested persons in the community. That might include some business people or some professionals, but it included parents and just people who were interested in seeing that the school was being run for the needs of the students and the community, etc. And in the Academies programme, we saw a real professionalisation of that were lots of governing bodies were kind of disbanded, and then they brought in business people, professionals that had particular kinds of skill sets, finance skill sets, accounting skill sets. And so we see a lack of democracy through those things too. So I think that's one way that that kind of leadership and governance shifted as part of the Academies programme. And my colleague Kirsty, she's in Berlin actually, but she wrote this piece called Heroic Heads, so heroic head teachers or principals of the school, and about this thing that's sort of emerged on certain kinds of people being like really charismatic in a particular way and running schools, and how they become quite powerful. So they often move from one job to a sort of higher authority job from different kinds of contexts. And I think, pay has changed quite drastically. I think there's some people on big money now that they never used to be. And this is government funding. This is, state money for different kinds of jobs. And even the name of it, head teachers, is always what teachers were called who ran schools. Now they're called principals, CEOs of academy trusts. Even the name of it has shifted as well. So, yeah.
I like the question, Ruben, that you ask about leadership, and it makes me think about Martin Luther King and him as a leader and the kinds of things that he advocated. Basically, he was a very strong advocate of democracy. He talked a lot about how capitalism essentially was attacking democracy. I mean, they could work together, but he was arguing that they were not. And you really do not have strong leaders today, certainly not like an MLK, who will talk about democracy versus capitalism, or proposing democratic reforms as opposed to promoting capitalism as it currently is. What you have instead are Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives, in many ways promoting the same thing, which is I think Kirsty, as you framed it as corporate speak, and and that's what it is. There's a really good book. I was trying to recall the author, but the name of the book is called Leadership BS. And what a damning indictment on how leadership has become reduced to marketing.
Yeah, I was just going to say something as well about the. Sorry, did you want to come in there, Ruben? I don't want to cut you. No. Okay. About the move to sort of delegitimize leadership. It's been something that I've been thinking about as part of ongoing politics in England. We have a really right-wing conservative government who have served to delegitimize what a leader should be. Boris Johnson, for example, I think people were more disbelieving, as something that you were talking about before, Nathan, like it becomes more about, well, what's the point of this? Why would we engage with this? It doesn't make sense. It's not serious. And then we have a series of policies that are actively, against different kinds of human rights and things like that through other so-called leaders in the party. But we don't have an opposition that's really strong. And when one of the conversations that always comes up, obviously, was around 2017 and Jeremy Corbyn and that sort of movement of people, and people trying to delegitimize that movement. He's still brought up, even though he's not even a sitting MP at the minute, I don't think. But one of the arguments I was trying to make when people were talking about him and focusing on him as part of it was the idea of a leader. I think for people that I were talking to that's not what we care about. We don't want a shiny suit or a shiny face to tell us or to lead the movement. We just need good policies and good practices that would make a difference. So there's something about trying to delegitimize the idea of leadership at the same time as acknowledging, like, how do you change things without a leader? In some ways it's really difficult, but it's been something that I've thought about quite quite a lot, especially in terms of politics and how it is. Because, unfortunately, Keir Starmer, I don't know the difference between him and the Conservative Party currently. So, it's difficult.
Speaking of politics and Nathan's emphasis on religion, here in the United States, we have what we would call political evangelism, which is an incredible impact on what is going on now, particularly in terms of both promoting entrepreneurship. And I think that there's a concept there. I forget what it is. Is it prospect religion or I don't know, something like that. I forget the concept, but also looking very, very closely at people becoming entrepreneurs and taking over institutions, right? Particularly the schools and so on. And I was wondering if that's also happening over there.
Yeah, I think it's something that I teach a module called Critical Education Studies, and it's something that I brought up on the week on critical race theory. That's definitely been a thing that has been co-opted over. Kemi Badenoch, who was our equalities minister at the time, she was very much saying that we don't want critical race theory. There is a sort of neutrality clause for teachers in primary and secondary education. That's always kind of been there. And I think they added in not talking about capitalism negatively, having two sides of the argument, that kind of stuff. So that has been something that's been brought over. It's not been banned. We have academic freedom. I also don't know how they would ban something that's so expansive and nuanced, and it's not a thing. It's multiple things. But there was also a bit of a there's certain kind of key political players. We have a new news program called GB News. And I think that's kind of trying to bring that kind of thing over. The drag queens reading to children has been another site that's kind of, I think, traveled a little bit, unfortunately. So, but it's not really been a thing here. So I think there was a protest where it wasn't even happening. So they were protesting something that wasn't real, which was quite interesting to watch. These things become so symbolic and thin air that actually, they lose a little bit of meaning. But that's the scary bit, is when it's not even real, it can still be so powerful. Oh gosh, sorry, that's my dog trying to get through the door. So yeah, I think some of it's traveled. There doesn't seem to be the embeddedness of that kind of cultural stuff that I see from Marjorie Taylor. Yeah, I've seen some of her talks. But I think, as I said before, with the likes of sort of Boris Johnson, I think, and some of the things that this Conservative government have done have explicitly delegitimised the system as we could have expected it. I don't think that they, how do I put this? I think there's an explicitness of them doing something different than what we might expect of a prime minister. So, I'm not being sort of Marxist about this, but, if we think that they're in power to make money for themselves and their friends as one of their main things, rather than running the country in a way that we would see as acceptable, I think that shift is quite an obvious one, and one that we might not have expected before that. Even though some of us might say that was always part of it. But I think, we have a young MP who's just resigned. She was from the Scottish National Party, called Mhairi Black. I don't know if you've seen her. And I saw her on a podcast, and she said, she wouldn't say the name of the MP, but they said to her, if you don't make £1 million in your first year, you're doing it wrong. And I thought, and she's left now. She's resigned, which is, a sad day really. But yeah.
When you were talking earlier about the rise of academies, you had, one of the ways you talked about it was that it was a moralizing initiative, which is in a sense a way to kind of beat people down, whether it's really moral or not. And I was listening to you talk right now, I was thinking about whether intended or not, Donald Trump really got the religious right on his side and was able to take his agenda and turn it, at least among some people, into a moral crusade. And once you can get a segment of the population that supposedly thinks in moralistic terms, it is hard to counter that, even if the moralizers and their views lead to immoral consequences, which I think today is rampant.
Yeah, I've only thought of moralizing in quite a micro sense so far, I think, but I think there's definitely something about seeing it in a more moral economies thing. I mean, I've thought about that before. I hadn't put those two things together fully in what I've been thinking about for the book, for example. But yeah, I thought about it in the way that Ruben was talking about it, in the way that people blame themselves. You're not a good person, or you don't have good character. As part of a special issue on character education. I think the piece I did about the badges and the different tensions of theories of power in practice, that was part of an edited, a special collection for a journal about character education in England, and the different parts of that. But yeah.
I mean, yeah, if you can get entrepreneurship and discuss it in as a statement or an indictment on one's moral character, you are essentially moralizing with a hammer. And people really need to find something to stand on strongly to counter it. Which I would say education provides.
Yeah, what moralizing seems to do is create one of the contradictions, I think, that Kirsty's talking about, and that is anti-indoctrination actually leads to indoctrination, because you narrow what people can learn. There's no freedom to learn and no freedom to teach, ultimately. And what's scary about moralizing, particularly with regard to religious morality, is the certainty of it, is that the protagonists are so certain that they are right, even though they're grounded perhaps in religious ideas rather than, what's going on here in the world.
One of the oxymorons is you take Florida's governor, Ron DeSantis, and here he is at a podium, and at the podium it says indoctrination. And at the same time, he's talking against critical race theory from a very ignorant point of view. He really doesn't even know what he's talking about, but yet he's talking about, yeah, but that's indoctrination. And yet the issue here is that his whole agenda is indoctrination.
And we have an even more insidious form of sort of representation politics in the UK at the minute, because Kemi Badenoch is a Black woman. We had Priti Patel, and now we have Suella Braverman, who are two women of colour. We have Rishi Sunak as well, who's the Prime Minister at the minute. And this is like the first time we've seen, in terms of representation, people of colour in those powerful positions a lot of the time, and for the Conservative government as well. But ultimately, they have some of the most right-wing, authoritarian, lack of humanity, the policies that I've heard, and obviously speaking against things like critical race theory, which is quite scary at the same time. I was going to say something else. It wasn't quite about politics. Oh, it was about, at the minute as well, there's lots of different kinds of strikes going on, and there's this place in government where people who are running businesses and have taken from the public purse because they've run their businesses badly. So things like Thames Water, where they've had to be like renationalised because they, even when they were in deficit, they were taking dividends for their shareholders, and the government's been having to pay them because they aren't doing it properly. Those people and their lack of, they will just deny like what they're doing, or they will spin, or they will just refuse to answer questions, and they'll talk around the question. And it's like multiple of them. There's a guy from Royal Mail, that Thames Water, and all their workers at the same time are on strike for better pay, while they're saying they can't pay it, but taking huge amounts of money, like doubling profits for shareholders at the same time. We have it on the railways at the minute. We have, obviously, universities are on strike for slightly different reasons, but there's this, I think, wider thing, not just in terms of politicians, but like the business leaders as well, are kind of doing some of that practices of denial or ignorance, or, you know, refusal. I don't know what you might call it.
We're getting close to the end of our session here, and I have one brief question for you, Kirsty, and then I'll give Nathan an opportunity to make a closing comment and you to make a closing comment. But in all of this, I've been wondering, where is Anthony Giddens? Has he got anything to say about all of this?
He just won a prize somewhere, like he definitely, I saw it pop up somewhere that he'd won some sort of prize. So yeah, I mean, maybe we need a fourth way.
Nathan, closing comments?
I think it's a real shame that humanity today has the potential to solve so many problems that have plagued humanity for centuries. And rather than do that, the whole thing has been usurped to make a profit. And it's just completely unnecessary. And unfortunately, many of those, certainly not all, but many of those who are being hit hardest by this are actually complicit in perpetuating it. I mean, I know that we've kind of covered a lot of ground in our talk today, but personally, I think that's a really good thing. But when it all really comes down to it, entrepreneurship, which could have led to huge breakthroughs and innovations that would have benefited millions and millions of people, has instead allowed itself to be reduced to an immoral argument, I would say.
Thank you. Very well said. And I live for the day when I can send my car into outer space. Kirsty?
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's, obviously, we know ecological disaster might mean that, you know, we have to think about these things differently. There's some emerging conversations, some emerging acknowledgements, but I think the way that I was quite interested in youth kinds of activisms was maybe around some of that stuff going forward too. Again, living in these places that inherently have to reproduce it. We live in environments in the world, but trying to save us from what is imminent, I think, in terms of ecological disaster. So yeah, not an entirely positive note, but again, no, just a realistic one maybe. Yeah, and just thank you for inviting me, because I've really enjoyed it as always.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, and it's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you and with Nathan, and we are looking forward to the publication of your book. We'll invite you to come back and give us a little more detail on it.
Yeah.
Very much.